I'm calling the meeting to order, and I'm going to do the alphabetical calling of the list. Brinkerhoff,
Present.
Carney,
Here.
Gilliland,
Here.
Jones,
Here.
Corhan,
Here.
McCallum,
Here.
Miller,
Here.
Najaris, he's not here, O'Connell here, and Silva Khan, not here, and Smith.
Here.
The next item is the August 6th meeting notes have been circulated. Any comments on those notes?
Bill, if we could take a step back, I'd like to make an introduction if there's any attendees from the public. So I just want to go ahead and mention this meeting is being held virtually, and viewers are welcome to provide public comment online or by telephone at 669-900-9128. And the meeting ID is 816-4120-8163. If you are watching the meeting on Zoom and wish to provide public comment, please select the participants icon and select raise hand. If you are participating by telephone and wish to provide public comments, please press *9 when the chair opens a public comment period. When it is your turn to speak, you will hear a notification that you've been unmuted and you have 2 minutes to speak. At this time, we have no one from the public attending.
Thank you, Simon.
Sure.
Moving now to those August 6th meeting notes. Any comments or questions? You know, the one thing I will say is you're a good writer, Joe. They're well composed.
Thank you.
That's important.
Appreciate it.
Do I hear a motion?
I
to approve them?
move.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. Since there are no public attendees, we will move past the public comment on non-agenda items and proceed with the presentation by Ethan Guy on inclusionary housing.
Great. So let me share my screen and get that pulled up. Right. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. So what I'm going to be covering today is really just a summary of the City Council actions as it relates to potential amendments to the San Rafael Municipal Code facilitating housing development and streamlining approvals. Super long title. But essentially, how this came about, it started about 2 years ago with the comprehensive report to City Council on Housing on August 20th, 2018, which covered a few topics, including rental protection, short-term rentals, housing for the aging population, as well as this final bullet, challenges to approving and developing housing. From that August 20th meeting, we came back with a report specifically on those challenges on September 4th, 2019, which was an informational report laying out those 11 challenges as well as 13 recommended actions and measures. From there, we did a little bit more development on those challenges, on those developments, and we created a housing work plan, which the City Council approved on January 21st, 2020. So as part of that work plan, it outlined 15 policies to incentivize and streamline housing development. We've already implemented 6 of those policies. Policies 1 through 6 are not listed here on the right. What City Council considered were 5 policies that were included in that informational report. So those are policies 7, 8, 11, 12, and 15, the ones highlighted to the right. Now, we do have 2 policies that are currently under development, policies 9 and 10, which are by right zoning for affordable housing projects and a new accessory dwelling unit ordinance. Those are currently under development and they'll go back to City Council at a later date. So what I'm here to specifically talk about is this informational report that outlined those 5 policies that went to City Council on September 8th, 2020, and included discussions on inclusionary housing requirement, the density bonus, formalizing the design review subcommittee, as well as permit process changes to the hillside exception, the appeals process, height bonus, as well as small lots. Now, at that September 8th, 2020 meeting, there was so much information that got discussed that City Council continued it to September 21st, and they asked us to come back with a summary table so that they could confirm the policy direction before staff moved forward. Now, this slide outlines what that policy direction is, and I just want to be very clear that no policy actions happened on the 21st. Every one of these policies will have to come back, sometimes to the Planning Commission and then the City Council, but sometimes just to the City Council before they would be implemented. This was the 21st action was mostly just to get staff direction about next steps. Now, those policies included the inclusionary housing requirements, and I'll go a little bit more into this next. The next step on that inclusionary housing requirement would be to proceed with the 10% below market rate equivalent that was presented. That was a scenario that was presented to City Council, as well as allowing buyouts for projects that have gotten planning approval, so they've been entitled, but they haven't pulled building permits yet. So allowing them to buy out at the per unit rate that was set by the Loch Lomond Marina project, which is $609,000 per unit. The next steps with the inclusionary housing requirement would be proceeding to the Planning Commission and then City Council for public hearings on the amendments necessary to make these changes. The second policy that City Council considered was the density bonus changes. Now, the density bonus changes really just focus on simplifying the density bonus ordinance itself so that it aligns with new state regulations. There's not much else that's happening there, but since we are talking about density bonus, sometimes there's a little concern about what we're doing there, but it's simply just to align the density bonus with the state regulations. And like the inclusionary housing ordinance, that would need to go to the Planning Commission and then City Council for public hearings because they're amendments to the SRMC. The third piece had a little bit more discussion, and that was formalizing the design review subcommittee. So right now, we're not able to convene the full design review board because of limitations through COVID-19. So what we had been doing is piloting this subcommittee process where we have 2 representatives from the design review board that are helping kind of oversee a smaller process. It's worked fairly well for the last 6 months. And we brought forward to City Council an option to pilot a less formal design review board as a design review advisory committee. This would be a smaller design review board that is more informal, and it's more so to kind of an open discussion with the applicants to try to expedite planning approvals. Now, this would still include public noticing procedures and measures similar to a zoning administrator meeting format. And also one thing that we're also considering is switching the order from going design review board, then planning commission, to having projects go to the planning commission first and then design review board. Now, these were still kind of in the process of working out some of the kinks. And since it's not going to be a formal change in amendment to the SRMC, because it would be a pilot, it would simply just be a policy resolution. We're going to be working with the design review board to kind of work out some of the policy details that we would need to figure out. So this one isn't as on fast of a timeline as the other policies, but it's still something that we're moving forward with. And then finally, we had several smaller amendment changes that were really intended just to streamline process improvements that focused on the hillside exception, the appeals process, the height bonus, and small lots. So most of these were proceeding with the ordinance amendments. There wasn't much concern about a lot of them because they were either adding procedures that don't exist in the case of the appeals process, or in the case of the height bonus and small lots, changing small little things in the municipal code that can help incentivize development. As it relates specifically to the hillside exception, really all that we're talking about when we talk about the hillside exception is downgrading the review from currently what goes to the City Council into having it go to the Planning Commission first. So if the Planning Commission approves it, there's still an opportunity to appeal to the City Council. Rather, any hillside exception doesn't have to go immediately to City Council. And that's consistent with all similar planning permit applications that includes exceptions. So it's just aligning the hillside exception with everything else. There's no changes happening in technical studies, anything like that. It's just the exception piece of the hillside review, downgrading it to a Planning Commission review rather than City Council. And again, like the inclusionary housing requirement and the density bonus, this would need to proceed to the Planning Commission and then the City Council for public hearings because they are amendments to the San Rafael Municipal Code. So to spend a little bit more time on the inclusionary housing portion of this. So currently, we have a few separate categories for inclusionary housing. So it ranges depending upon the size of the unit. It can go anywhere from 10% to 20% below market rate requirement on site. We allow for in lieu fees in the cases of fractional units. If they're below 0.5 fractional units, and I can explain all that if we need to. What City Council's direction included was downgrading that 20% to what's a 10% equivalent. And the reason why I'm saying it's a 10% equivalent is because we're changing up a lot of the elements of what that equivalent is. It's not going to be all on site. So the one major change that we're doing is rather than having categories for 2 to 10 units, 10 to 20 units, and 20 plus units for both rental and for sale, we're just simplifying it across the board and making it 2 to 15 units and 16 plus units. And then this is where there's a bit of a difference. So in our current ordinance, we only have one requirement. It's 20% on site, depending if it's a 20 plus unit property. What we're doing now is, and that we're moving forward to City Council with, is a change to that so that if you're a 2 to 15 unit property, you pretty much maintain the same requirement, which is 10% on site. But if you're a 16 plus unit property, we're allowing you to meet the baseline requirement, use your primary requirement at a 5% low income on-site housing. Now, we have what's called an additional requirement. In the additional requirement, a developer still has to choose something. They just have an option of what they choose in order to meet their inclusionary housing requirement. So what we're giving them is 4 potential options for how they want to choose how they meet the rest of the inclusionary housing requirement. So the first option would be through additional on-site units. So those on-site units, you could either provide 5% more low-income housing on the property, or you could meet a 10% moderate income housing. So the below market rate requirement is either capped at 15% low income or 10% for moderate income. Secondly, we're also allowing developers to pay what's known as an in lieu fee. So an in lieu fee is essentially a per unit fee that's paid by the developer in lieu of providing on-site units. So right now, that amount is about $343,000. And we would allow a developer to meet their additional requirement through paying a payment equal to 5% of the total units. So what do I mean by that? Let's say we have a 20 unit property. That's the final amount is 20 unit property. In order for them to pay the in lieu fee, they would have to provide a payment equal to 1 unit's worth of payment. So that'd be about $343,000. The bigger the property, the more percentage they have to pay. But that's generally the high level overview of what an in lieu fee is. Additionally, we would allow the developer to provide units off-site or through what's known as a land conveyance. A land conveyance, an example of that would be kind of what happened with Whistle Stop, where BioMarin is purchasing part of the property and they're giving the land to Whistle Stop to build the remainder of the property. In both of these cases, the property would still have to meet the similar economic benefit of either the 5% or the 10% on site. So it wouldn't necessarily just be, oh, here's some land or here's a property. There'd have to be some sort of economic benefit with similar benefits to the city in order for us to even accept it. And in both cases, it would still require a level of review by the director. In the case of the offsite property, you would be able to provide those units as long as they're within a half mile of the market rate project. So that's a lot. So that's all I put together, but I am happy to go into anything more. We have lots of presentations. I just wasn't totally sure what exactly some of your questions would be, so I don't want to talk too much time for me talking.
Was this program vetted by any developer type as to its financial impact, or best estimate of financial impact, or was this something we relied on internal numbers, or how did we decide that this would be effective? That we thought, predict it's going to be effective.
Yeah, so there's three ways that we went about this. So the first piece, and this is in full transparency, I used to be an inclusionary housing consultant, so this used to be my job. So I was familiar kind of with what are the levels that need to be pulled, what's the analysis that need to be conducted. I used to be the guy that you hired to do that level of analysis. The second piece is that one of the main tools that we used it's put out by a group called Grounded Solutions Network, and they've actually put together calculators where you're able to play with those numbers based upon real data from real projects in your area. So we use data from the Bay Area to stress test and determine feasibility across several different options about these projects. So we used two different prototypes. We used a 30-unit prototype and a 60-unit prototype, and stress test them across three different scenarios that were presented to City Council on September 8th. At the 10% equivalent, that was the only level where all projects were considered feasible across all different options. We also presented a 15% equivalent, which did have 3 of the 4 different prototypes that we analyzed were feasible, but because there was one that was not feasible, there was a recommendation to move forward with a 10%. And then finally, we did take this analysis and present it to both advocacy groups and developers to get their sense. I'll say that a lot of the developers, when they took a look at this, they were most favorable for the 10% option because their findings were similar to what we were finding when we were doing our prototype analysis, which was that was really the only one that they were citywide getting feasibility numbers. That the 15%, some parts of the city weren't necessarily feasible in other parts of the city.
So what is the expectation if we adopt this in terms of improving our affordable housing opportunities?
So there's 2 pieces to that. The first piece is that with any inclusionary housing change, this shouldn't be just like a static thing that we don't ever revisit. We should be revisiting our inclusionary housing requirements. So one piece that council did direct us to is to put in place a path for us to revisit in a year. So a year is a little soon for us to be able to see any measurable change, but it at least gives us an opportunity to kind of take a look and make sure that the numbers are generally right, the percentages are generally right, all of that. The second piece is that most consultants in most kind of recent analysis when it comes time for inclusionary housing, looking at whether or not to require on-site or below market or an in-lieu fee, most studies today pretty much say if you live in a high cost area, which the Bay Area is an extremely high cost, it is most effective for building affordable housing to accept an in-lieu fee. Because the in-lieu fee it's fungible, it's dollars that we can spend on whatever we need to as long as it relates to affordable housing. So in a nationwide survey, most housing trust funds, which is where this money would go, was able to leverage $1 of a trust fund funding into $6 of housing financing dollars. So for every dollar that the city spent, the project got $6 in other funding sources. In some jurisdictions, that was as high as 16 to 1. And another example is in Seattle, when they made the switch over to in-lieu fees, they saw a realization of for every 1 unit's worth of in-lieu fees that were paid to the cities, they saw a realization of 3 units built for their projects.
Wow.
Now, Seattle is not San Rafael. There's lots of differences, but generally, in-lieu fees are more effective use of those dollars.
Ethan, do you mind just giving us a overview of how much money is in like the in-lieu fee pool now, what expectations would be on how much that might grow, and what the tactics for deploying that would be?
Yeah, so it's a good question. Right now, we have a balance of about $1.6 million. And that balance has been about the same for the last few years. And the reason for that is we allow for in lieu fee payments in for the city, but generally it's only for small projects who only have a fractional amount. So what that fractional amount is let's say you have 10% of a 4-unit project, that would net you 0.4 on-site units. Can't really provide 0.4 on-site units, so we allow for you to pay an in lieu fee equivalent to 0.4 units. That's how we've gone about so far. We do also have what's known as a commercial linkage fee, which pays into our trust fund, but really that we only get that if we have like a very large commercial project coming in. So we did get some of that funding recently through both Oakmont and Aegis. They did pay a large commercial linkage fee, but we don't get those. We don't get that much money on an ongoing basis. Now, what I'll say is I don't personally expect us to be getting millions of dollars each year, right? It's tied to the housing market and how many projects move forward. But if we get 1 or 2 units worth of in lieu fees, we're making more in our trust fund than we normally do in 2-3 years. So there's a lot that we can do with $500,000 here or $1 million or 600,000. And case in point is we're actually moving forward on Monday with a resolution to do some allocation of our trust fund dollars. So we're allocating $1.5 million. Well, City Council is considering a resolution to allocate $1.5 million for both Whistle Stop, so the senior units that would join at the Whistle Stop project at 999 3rd Street, as well as 190 Mill Street for the permanent supportive housing there. Additionally, we also have the Loch Lomond buyout money that will also be going to the trust fund, which is $3.6 million. And we expect all that money to come in by end of Q1 next year. They've already made a $1.8 million payment to the trust fund. So we're expecting another $1.6 million or $1.8 million payment to the trust fund by March. I just threw a lot of numbers out there, so I'm happy to kind of break those down.
Thank you. One of the things about the graph you had up last that I was trying to understand was in 16 plus unit developments, does the developer have the opportunity to pay the in lieu fee totally and not provide any affordable housing? Is that what I was understanding?
No, that's a good question. So at the 16 plus unit amount, whether it's for sale or rental, you still have to provide 5% on site. So no matter what, you're required to put 5% low-income housing on site. The option that the developer has is whether or not they want to provide additional on-site affordable units, and they get the choice between providing at 5% low income or for 10% of units at moderate income, or that in lieu fee, or the land conveyance or the offsite. What I'll say is that the offsite and the land conveyance, while we're including those to provide flexibility, they very rarely are used in projects because of the additional level of review that needs to go into them and the additional level of analysis that needs to go in to make sure that we're meeting a similar economic benefit.
Ethan, I have a question. You talked about the resolution that's going to be presented, or that council's considering for the trust fund. What other projects has the trust fund been used for in the past few years?
So we haven't actually spent the trust fund dollars in a long time. Right now, the trust fund kind of maintains a small balance. Part of the fund goes to help pay for the administration of our below market rate unit projects, which is done through the Marin Housing Authority, not through the city. And there's a huge cost savings by having the MHA do it. I think we pay like $10,000 a year to operate a program that would require an additional staff person here to do. So there's large savings there. And part of the reason why we don't spend our trust fund dollars is because, and this isn't unique to San Rafael, it's everybody who has a trust fund. Those funds are precious. So there's a lot of hesitancy to spend those dollars when you don't collect an in lieu often. So a lot of cities, they wait for the perfect project, and sometimes that project never materializes, so you don't spend the dollars. The hope with an in lieu fee is that you get some regular revenue coming into that fund to help you better make spending decisions in the future. So if you know that you're going to get $500,000 each year, or generally in that range, you might be more willing to spend the dollars in that trust fund than if you know you're only going to get $1 million for the next 10 years.
Ethan, you mentioned earlier on that you mentioned an in lieu fee of in the 600,000s, and I was saying, okay, now we're finally getting there, because that's kind of what a unit might cost. What was that, and why only, you know, in the 300s?
Happy to break that down. So there's several ways to figure out the in lieu fee. The most complicated is conducting a nexus study. And the good news is that there's a recent court decision that we don't have to do that anymore, which is great because they're incredibly complicated and incredibly expensive to conduct. What we do have to do is what's called an affordability gap analysis, which is essentially saying how much does it cost to build a unit? What's the difference between a market rate unit and an affordable unit? What's the sale price, or what's the expected revenue between those two? And that gap is what the in lieu fee is. That's that $343,000 number. And the last time that we updated that $343,000 number was 2006. So it's old, and it does not reflect current market trends. We still have to go through a process to update that, which we're working on with the county right now. We actually, I think I had the meetings next week with the consultant to actually do the analysis. But we're probably not going to get the results of that analysis until the end of next year, just because we're saving money by working with a lot of other Marin jurisdictions. The $609,000 amount that I was bringing up is we recently were approached by Loch Lomond Marina about buying out 11 of the remaining units. Now, they were having difficulty filling out the units, and they asked us if we might be willing to settle on an amount. So we negotiated an amount of $609,000 based upon some formulas that were in the original BMR agreement, which to us kind of set that high bar for like, what is that highest amount that we think these units are worth? And that's the unit that we're providing at $609,000. Because we have a data point for that, that's what we're saying. Any project that wants to buy out any on-site units, you have to pay that amount, not the $343,000. Now, what I think is important, I'm happy to go into that a little bit more. The reason why I think that's important is when you look at the amount of dollars that a affordable housing developer needs from a city to make a project feasible. So what is the per unit amount that a city would need to give an affordable housing unit developer per unit to make that project feasible? The amount is only $45,000 in Marin. Yeah.
How much is that? I'm sorry?
Yeah.
45?
So $45,000.
Oh.
That's the average. That's the average amount that the city and the county have given to affordable housing developers to make their projects feasible. Now, a similar conducted in Oakland, and it was about $125,000. So truth is in there somewhere, right? $45,000 might have just been because we have a small sample size, but that's the amount that when I go to that leveraging of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund dollars, that's kind of that dollar amount that shows what we're able to leverage with a local bank. So the reason why I bring that up is, yes, $343,000 is significantly less than $609,000, but that doesn't mean that it's not effective. It still is effective at being able to provide and get us affordable housing. It's just, it's a different amount. And the reason why, the argument that we made in the staff report for why we should still move forward with $343,000 and not the $609,000 is because that $609,000 takes into account opportunity cost to the city. So a project that is going through plan approvals may or may not move forward, right? It's a project that may not exist in a year or 2 years from now. But a project that's gotten their building permits and is about to build building permits, that's a whole lot more real of a project. And the cost of us losing those units is a whole lot more, it's a whole lot higher than a project coming in at the planning level. So that was the justification for us to say it's okay for us to accept a lower amount for a project that's just applying now today. But for a project that we've already approved, we want a higher per unit fee.
Okay, so that's the difference for the developer, because the developers already spent all that money. It seems like, well, it's going to cost you 600 something thousand to build another unit, but we'll let you give us only 347,000.
Yeah.
And because you don't want to put it on site. And then you're not in the position of building anything yourself. You have to depend on a nonprofit developer to put all the pieces together to then give them whatever extra they need. So it seems like the developers getting a real deal there in terms of whether, what it would cost the developer to go out and build those units.
But I'm confused a little bit because I'm wondering, is the fee meant to be the capitalized value of the difference between market rent and lower moderate income rent, the capitalized difference? Or is it meant to be the price that it costs to build a unit from scratch?
It's the capitalized difference. Generally, it's kind of when that comes in. So generally, what you're looking at is probably the easiest way to think about it is through a for sale unit, right? So if a for sale unit costs, at the end of the day, $500,000 market rate, and an affordable housing unit costs $250,000. That's what the sale price would be. The in lieu fee would be $250,000.
Right.
Yeah.
But for rental housing.
Yeah, and that's why it's a little bit different for rental housing. So the analysis that gets conducted is pretty thorough. They essentially look at a bunch of different prototypes in a bunch of different parts of the city with a bunch of different size properties, rentals, projections, and then they give you an average at the end of the day. But there's a lot of analysis that goes into kind of what is that amount. And when it was initially set in 2006, the fee was actually about $250,000. And then it increases each year based upon CPI. What I'll say is that CPI increase has not kept up with the actual cost of housing, even though it's pegged somewhat to the cost of housing. That's why we need to kind of do a true up. And we need to go through this formal affordable housing affordability gap analysis to actually do that update.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Is there a formal review process that is required along with this so that, say, at the end of 4 years, we evaluate the results from these changes?
Yeah, so we're still drafting the ordinance right now. So we are going to build in at least an opportunity to review at year one, because that was asked specifically by City Council, is to include a year one review. What I'd say is that generally best practices when it comes to inclusionary properties, it's a 3 to 5 year review cycle. And that's generally how long a construction project takes. Because even if we pass this today, developers still need to find a site, start getting some financing, start doing pre-planning. So the actual time that we even start seeing projects who are taking advantage of these reduced inclusion, like really taking advantage of the inclusionary housing, not just projects that are already far along, projects that are from start to scratch, that's still probably a year to 3 years out until we actually see those projects. And City Council recognized that, but I think what they want to see is that are we going to be in a different economic position as a region in a year from now that will cause us to want to rethink our inclusionary housing?
I guess my question is whether or not, I mean, I understand that the timeline is longer. That's why I'm asking the question. I don't think a year will be interesting to talk about, but really it should be a 4-year or maybe even 5-year analysis. Is that going to be part of your proposal on the final draft?
That will be something that we might include as an option. The only thing that we have clear direction on right now is that 1 year. So generally, it's not something that normally gets included specifically into the ordinance itself, but is rather a guideline or a policy resolution that follows up. It's not something that's necessarily in the ordinance, just in case. You never know if in 5 years you may have 2 major economic impacts that you might want to review something before that 5-year cycle. So it's something that's up for discussion. I'm sure City Council would be interested in hearing those opinions. It's just something that we weren't asked specifically as staff to include.
Well, but as staff, you want to write as good an ordinance as you can.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it's obvious to me that a formal review that's required then requires City Council and staff to take a look at what's happened and say, hey, the ordinance is working, or the ordinance is kind of stupid. We should, either change it or eliminate it or do something different.
Yeah.
If you don't have that, somehow that conversation never really occurs. People have good intentions at times like these, but when the rubber hits the road.
And all I'm saying is the only clear direction that we have is to review in 1 year. What we put in the final ordinance for City Council approval, I don't know if we're going to put a 3-year, a 4-year, or a 5. Like, we don't know what that specific number is going to be yet. But I get what you're saying, and you might see something in the ordinance now.
I would suggest that that's a number, or that number of year review is going to be something that changes going forward and will be repeated, and should be, frankly, with something this major, should be as frequently as possible, so you can really monitor this stuff. And my sense of, I think, anyway, I think that's true, particularly when we're about to enter a rewrite of the housing element of the general plan, which is due in another 2 or 3 years. And that process is going to be starting very soon. And certainly tracking on the success of this is very important. My sort of biggest concern at this point is the lack of metrics identified as to what success means. And that would include going forward, of course. We need to know how to judge, the stated goal, as I heard the council talking about it, was this will bring more affordable housing to the city. By cutting the affordable housing requirement in half, we're going to get more affordable housing. How can that be? Oh, we're going to get more development housing overall, and therefore we will get more affordable housing. Well, that means, just rough math means that to accomplish that, since we're cutting the requirement in half, we're going to have to double the amount of housing during the next 2 years, 5 years, whatever that is. That's a pretty big goal. And we should be really clear that that's the goal, unless I'm wrong in my math. And it may be more elaborate than that. I also think that lacking here has been an objective metrical look back at what's been happening in the last, I would go 15 or 20 years because of the recession. What's been the production of affordable housing under the 20% requirement that we're trying to improve on? Because I think there's been an accepted mythology, or I shouldn't put that word on it, a mythos, a belief that in fact, by dramatically reducing the numbers, we're going to get more development and more housing. But we need to know what the standards are that we're judging that against, both in the past and therefore in the future, to see if we've succeeded or not.
Yes, there's a few points there. Kind of hitting on the mythos question first. We're in a housing crisis. We're not meeting our RENA, and we're not producing enough housing.
Of all types are affordable?
All types. We well below where the last RENA cycle says that we need to be. We've had staff report after staff report that kind of reiterates how poorly we are doing. It's not just San Rafael. I mean, this is pretty much everyone is not meeting the RENA. And we're not meeting it by orders of magnitude than where we need to be. So while if you do a look back, I mean, simply what you need to look at is where we are as performing at RENA, and it's not good. So the second piece, and this is where I differ a little bit, Bill, as to kind of what the metrics are and kind of what specifically City Council is asking. And this is kind of me putting my personal like staff cap on, not anything else, is that how to determine whether or not this policy is succeeding is not going to be whether or not we're developing more affordable units specifically that are related to a doubling of total units, right? If we are seeing development and we're receiving in lieu fees that we're able to turn into affordable units, that's going to be one measure of success. So we're able to take in lieu fees, and it may not necessarily be new construction, it may be buying units, it may be buying down affordability elsewhere. There's a lot of different options that we'll have if we have a large trust fund. I think that the larger piece, though, is we're not going to see new units being developed that are related to this policy change for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, just because of the length of the development process that it takes to start seeing actual change from a policy change like this. In a year, we might get a sense of, okay, are we starting to see some of those roots get laid? But in a year, you're not going to see, you might see a project or two, but you're not going to see large change in the market in San Rafael as it relates to an inclusionary housing requirement. And the other piece that we discussed a little bit in the city council meeting is also inclusionary housing is only one tool in our toolkit. There's a whole lot of other things that we as a city need to look at, and council has directed us to look at to try to start lowering the barriers for housing development. That's things like objective design standards. That's things like looking at parking requirements and setback requirements and all these other design standards that make it difficult to have both market rate and affordable housing pencil.
Yeah, well, that's fine, of course. And so include all that in the metrics, but lay out the metrics. Mm-hmm. And include all kinds of housing. And I think the other thing that, I think we need to understand in this, and this is a good thing, that it's putting the city purely more in the development role of leveraging development by having more money coming from the in lieu fees. So this is a commitment on the part of the city to really step forward in a more, proactive way into leveraging affordable units and with the in lieu fees that are coming in. So I think the city needs to be clear about that there is a commitment here to staff and to whatever to support that going forward. It's an important change. One other thing I did want to just point out is that there's a value question here of on-site versus off-site, and I think arguments can be made both ways on that. But I think there is some benefit that we should all be aware of the kind of integration of affordable housing into the on-site development of market rate housing, versus taking money out of the project and then going and building a separate all affordable housing, apartment building somewhere else in the neighborhood. And it creates a different kind of community.
Ethan, I'm kind of following up on what Bill was discussing. I'm a little surprised at this discussion in one way, in that in my simple-minded way of trying to understand what's going on, I thought, oh, the city proposes to cut in half, essentially, the requirement for below market rate housing. And I assumed, but maybe I wrongly assumed, that was based on data and experience, that in fact, those working on a day-to-day basis on these kinds of issues in the city found out that there were projects that never went forward because of too large a percentage required to be below market rate housing. Or even that there was anecdotal evidence that the imposition of up to 20% rather than 10% of below market rate housing was preventing some developers from going forward or some projects from being proposed. And when I say I'm a little surprised, what I'm hearing, and I don't want to mischaracterize it, what I'm hearing instead is not, gee, we set the below market rate housing standard, the percentage too high, and therefore we have to reduce it, but we're speculating that if we cut the below market rate housing percentage in half, there will be more development. Am I right that this is just kind of a theory rather than something based on either data or experience or even anecdotal evidence?
I mean this with all due respect, but you are wrong. So we've been doing this for about, we've been looking at this for about 2 years. So how we've kind of been moving about this project is how this first started off was with interviews and discussions with area developers, asking them what are these impediments to development. And the main thing that we heard, both us as the city and also a separate report that was conducted by the Chamber of Commerce, is that our inclusionary housing requirement was too high. So not only that, we were hearing from developers that this was too high, that they don't have projects that are moving forward. Now, we didn't want to take that just as anecdotal evidence. We wanted to actually think about more kind of what exactly is that threshold amount. And so what we did there is take the pro forma analysis, so take what we know to be the general assumptions that go into the pro forma analysis for any project, peg that to real-time data for the Bay Area. So take real data from Bay Area developers, put it into a pro forma, and then stress test that to figure out whether or not a project is feasible or isn't feasible based upon industry standards in terms of profitability for the project itself. So we had already heard that our inclusionary housing requirement was too high. What we then wanted to essentially do with this pro forma analysis is to say, well, if they're saying that we need to get rid of it, we want to make sure that that's actually true. I mean, what is the level that we can put this at to actually meet an economic threshold for feasibility? And so we ran that at both the 20% requirement, which showed that only half of our 4 prototypes were feasible. When we ran it at the 15% equivalent, we found that 3 of the 4 were feasible. And when we ran it for the 10% equivalent, all 4 were feasible. Now, what I'd say about the 15% is that we're using an assumption, right? We were using essentially 15%. We were saying it result in a 15% yield on cost. So it needed to make 15% more revenue than it cost for it to be feasible. And a lot of those projects, except for the ones at the 10% equivalent, they were coming at like 15.5 or 15.6 or maybe 16. So, and that was when it's at the 15% equivalent or at the 20% equivalent. So what I mean by that is that these are assumptions, right? But we're using data, building the same form of spreadsheet pro forma analysis that a developer would use to make those decisions. And I think what's also important is not just what are the projects that we know about that didn't move forward, it's also really thinking about what are the projects that never even bothered to take a look at San Rafael because they knew our inclusionary housing requirement was too high.
So I've got a bit of an answer too. Roger, maybe you remember some of this, but it was, as I recall, the Chamber's Affordable Housing Committee that spurred the original 20% requirement 20 years ago, whenever it was that we did that. And given the experience that we've had since then, the Chamber has changed its mind, and that's due to what's gone on and talking with developers. They did not, as far as I know, do the kind of analysis with your model that you've got from Berkeley, but you know, from the standpoint of anecdotal evidence, there was lots of that, and so, you know, as the chamber looked at this, they came to the same conclusion as the city, and it maybe was part of the chamber's conferencing monthly with the city that might have suggested that it be reduced.
I will tell the committee, I actually am not as old as Dirk, so I don't remember it that well. I was with the chamber, but at that time, but I will say that I have seen these models, and they're relatively new for the public use. I mean, developers always provide themselves with a model to see if their projects are going to make sense. They are quite good at Excel spreadsheets. But you know, having seen some of these models in use to try to help cities determine what the developer is saying and what it means, you know, it's a great tool. And I'm sure when Ethan says it's not a, you know, it's not guesswork, I believe him. And you know, I think, though, I also want to say what Bill had said about the metrics. I wasn't going as far as that. I think you can't, I think our sample size of new projects that occur because of this ordinance are not going to be large. And we're going to rely a lot on anecdotal, again, information that the planning staff collects when they meet with developers and a whole variety of other things when we review this. It's not going to be done by pure metrics. It's just the sample sizes are too small. If we were a bigger city, it might be different. But you know, again, I think that review is important.
Well,
Thank you,
Roger,
Ethan, by the way. I did not know about, you know, that the spreadsheet analysis and the computations had been made. Maybe I missed it in the write-up.
And the best part is it's open to the public. So if you really want to get lost in the data, I am happy to send you the links. And they're fun models to play with. And they've developed them in such a way that anybody can use them. So very, very happy to share that information. I can get lost in it, so I'm a dork. So
When I get enough capital accumulated to start a project myself, I'll look closely at it.
I think you gave us links some time ago, right?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
A couple of other of us would go ahead, sweet. Go ahead.
All right, Katie, then you. I think just as a committee, I think it's important that we also look at some of those details where there's an option for 10% of, and I'm going to get the term wrong, but moderate income. And I think that that's really important for our community so that we don't become so polarized between super subsidized and, you know, super wealthy, that there is a middle ground that developers can both take advantage of to make their projects feasible, but that our community can continue to be vibrant and, you know, encompassing of everybody. And I think that's important. And I also think another thing that's important for our committee to consider and to think about is more housing development as a whole is good, because we don't just need affordable, subsidized, we also need attainable. And I think that that's really important for us when we're talking about, okay, so we're cutting the inclusionary requirements, but what do we gain from it? And we might gain more moderate income housing. We might also gain more workforce housing at market rate, all of which I think are really good for our community. San Rafael being such a diverse city, especially by Marin standards, I should say. But, you know, in terms of income levels, in terms of, you know, demographics, and I think that that's something that's really important to our identity as San Rafael that we would want to foster and continue with any changes to our housing policies. And I think that these changes to the inclusionary policy really do foster that. And I'm happy to see that.
And to kind of follow up a little bit on that point, because I think it's exactly what we were trying to get at when we were developing the policy. And when we had conversations with kind of these scenarios with developers, what we were hearing is that in some parts of the city, it makes sense to provide the additional low-income housing. In other parts of the city, it makes sense to provide the moderate. And in other parts of the city, it makes sense to pay the in lieu fee. So it's not always going to be a one-size-fits-all, and it really is going to be unique to the project itself.
I would simply like to be a little more forceful on something that Bill said, and I couldn't agree with you more about the affordable housing in general and moderate housing But we have a very diverse community. And I would be very concerned that the city uses this, quote, I'll call it a pot of money to create low-income housing in areas that are already low income. It's incredibly important that we diversify the city. And I would just be very mindful of that.
Totally agree with that point.
I think that would be a legitimate part of a review process in 4 or 5 years to see where the units are occurring, whether it's reinforcing existing patterns or not.
I agree.
Is it possible that the in lieu fee could be used in a way that the redevelopment agency used to encourage more affordable units on a specific project above what a developer might have put already to get 20% in a specific project?
Yeah, so there are specific uses that the trust fund can be used for, but the larger kind of like encompassing point that essentially kind of drives the use of the trust fund is just to make sure that there's more affordable housing in the city. That's like the purpose of the fund itself. And a lot of conversation goes into kind of what does that mean and what's the most effective use of those funds. In some years it may be building a construction project, right? Giving the funds to build something new. In other years it might mean a down payment assistance loan program where we're providing funds to homeowners so that they can buy a home. In other years, it might mean buying a property that already exists and protecting the units on those properties. So what we're going to get is going to be very different. And honestly, in probably 3 to 6 months from now, what we're going to be dealing with is going to be very different than what we dealt with 3 to 6 months from now. And so the idea behind and why the trust fund is so effective is that it just gives us another tool and the funds to kind of shape it to kind of what the community need is at that time. And so, yeah, absolutely. In some cases, it might just be us buying down the affordability on half of a project. The example that I think of is Centertown, the property on 3rd Street. That used to be a market rate project that went under. The city helped buy the property to turn it to 100% affordable property right in downtown. So there's lots and lots of options. And that was a redevelopment project itself.
So is this essentially to provide us with the funds that redevelopment did not?
Generally, yes. It's because of kind of the organizational structure of a redevelopment agency is very different. And Bill can probably answer this question a whole lot better than I can. A trust fund is different just because it's mostly just a funding mechanism, where RDA, I'm not even going to get into trying to explain RDA because Bill's on the call and he'll tell me what's right and what's not right.
It wasn't my part of it, but yeah. You know, the specific question about using the funds for, you know, in a new development, if the city infused some of its money into a development in order to get a higher percentage, is that specific use allowed in the priorities that have been, the criteria that have been set?
Yeah, so the ones that are like specifically called out in the guidelines are new construction, acquisition rehab, acquisition itself, or like homeownership type projects. Sometimes other things that it can also include is like legal assistance, pretty much anything that furthers affordable housing in the city.
And on a practical level, who would be the point person on administering the trust fund? Would there be a position for that, or would it be in the planning department? Where would you go if you had a proposal for that?
So generally, it falls on the CD director. So right now it would be Paul, and then the director would delegate. Sometimes it's kind of a tag team effort. For this last round, we actually knew the projects that were coming down the pike well before we even issued a NOFA. So it was kind of an effort where everybody had already worked on it. It was just a matter of going through the process of issuing a NOFA.
Mm-hmm. And would you expect the developer to approach you, or would you approach the developer?
Honestly, it really depends on the project itself. Most of the time, I'd say like 75% of the time, the developer approaches the city. So it's an Eden Housing or an EAH who says, hey, I want to move forward with this project. I'm trying to get my financing right. Is there going to be funds available for me to apply? And usually they'll say, like, I want $5 million, and the city will say, well, we only have $500,000. And they're like, oh, that works. Yeah.
I mean, I have seen situations though where planning staff sees a project they like, and the developer is struggling for one reason or another, and they say, well, we could offer this if you can do that, and so it can. Somebody who's on their toes will be able to figure that out. As I listen to this conversation, and it's good that we have critiques of it, I guess I've become more and more impressed with the fact that the city council has kind of opened things up widely. We can always change this if it's a fail, which is why I'd like to see a formal review as a scheduled item as opposed to a vague maybe. But whether or not all of the projects go into one neighborhood, or all these things are good concerns. But let it ride. We haven't had development. We can't get enough housing into our community. We need the housing. Let's see if this helps, and let's see if it helps in a way we like. And if it doesn't, let's revisit it.
Roger, I couldn't agree with you more.
I would like to, again, just put in a good word for tracking the results with numbers. And Roger and I are usually on the same page, on the same page about this, that, cost benefit analysis, however you phrase it, it's a good thing to see what results you're actually getting and be able to therefore have those discussions in the future. I also think we probably all agree that the increased flexibility and options that this provides is something that should be attractive to developers.
Bill, I don't disagree at all that we need the measurements. Absolutely.
My only hesitation, I love numbers, but my only hesitation is that I don't think in this particular arena that you can get enough numbers to make to be of value. It's a much more nuanced evaluation than that. Because again, if your sample size is small, it's really hard to draw conclusions. And the environment changes too.
But my point is, there needs to be, whether it's numbers, anecdotal, combination, there needs to be some sort of evaluation on an ongoing basis.
I'm okay with that. That's something we can write a letter of recommendation to the council, I believe. I mean, we don't have much input on this. This has already gone through council. Ethan has pointed out that there is a 1-year review period, and we're just saying we would like you to make sure there's also a 3, 4, or 5-year review period. Pick the number that you think makes the most sense.
Totally, and to be very clear, this still has to go back to the Planning Commission and City Council. We just got the direction to draft the ordinance to make changes. So again, that's kind of why you said, like, you want the metrics. I'm like, yeah, we can have metrics. We just haven't written them yet. So that's the process in which we're in right now, is trying to figure out kind of what is that needs to be included, and what needs to be included in the actual ordinance versus what might be in a policy resolution. So to kind of take a kind of the next step type of question, generally how we approach, how we've recently been trying to approach these kind of larger programmatic type policies, is to have an ordinance that spells out the specifics, like 10% or on-site, like those types of things. And then the administration piece usually is followed in a corresponding policy resolution. So that's the thing where it says, we will visit this in 1 year, we will visit this in 3 years and 5 years. And the reason for that is not because it doesn't change the effectiveness of that action. It's just, it allows us to make changes easier than going through the ordinance process, right? So if we need to make a change from 3 to 5 years, we can just go to City Council and say, let's make the change from 3 to 5 years. It doesn't require the Planning Commission, and then it's just easier to make those changes and more effective at responding to changes in the market.
The more flexibility you have, the better.
So I totally agree with everybody on metrics. I'll just say it might not be in the ordinance, it might be in the resolution type of thing.
I didn't hear any disagreement. I was just curious, will the review, will the spending of the funds be, I mean, I get that it's under the likely direction of the head of the planning department or community development, excuse me. But that seems like that should have some sort of citizen input.
Yeah. So because it's government, that's a separate process. But there's specific guidelines to how we administer those funds. So it is, we go through a NOFA, we have a conversation on the NOFA, we do scoring, we talk about those projects, and we say what they are. It's not just the development director just issuing the funds. There's a process that happens each time that we want to allocate those funds.
So Ethan, I know when you started this, you had a much longer menu of bonuses, actually, and incentives that the city might consider offering up. And that's kind of disappeared. I'm curious about, if that's something that's going to be revived later on. And an underlying question there is how, how the menus that are in the inclusionary zoning, inclusionary requirements, how those relate to other kinds of height bonuses and state bonuses and things like that. How does that all come together?
Yeah, it's a good question. So what Bill's referring to is part of what we were working on was trying to put together kind of a menu of options for developers to meet community benefits. So rather than going through kind of a protracted community benefit agreement process with negotiations, just kind of laying it all out on the table and saying, here are the things that we as the community say are important, and you have to meet X amount of these, or they all have like a point system attached to them, and you have to reach 300 points if you want to build another story. That's kind of what Bill's talking about. The reason why we didn't move forward with that is because the staff report, by the time that we finished with the inclusionary housing and everything else that I just discussed, was about 50 pages long. And we said, we should probably cut back a little bit on that. So it's still moving forward. We're still talking about it. But for the reasons that you just expressed, Bill, making sure that everything aligns with density bonus and height bonuses, we decided to kind of put a pause on that just because it's going to take more staff time to kind of work through all those nitty-gritty. But that does exist. That's something that we've had some preliminary conversations around. There's interest from lots of parties to move forward with it. But it's probably on more of like a 6-month track than I'd say like a 3-month track.
Ethan, I've got a nitpicky comment, which is I'm looking at the hard copy from the September 21 agenda report, the hard copy of the chart that you showed in your presentation. And it's broken into a rental column and a for sale column, but the contents of each column are identical. There's no distinction between what these requirements are. Why break it down into 2 columns?
Yeah, and the main reason for that is how the current ordinance is set up. So the current ordinance is split up for both rental and for sale. They handle them a little bit differently in the current. And generally, the for sale units have a little bit higher income requirements just because of the need to have a little bit higher income to meet down payment requirements, loan requirements. Under the new kind of proposal, they would be the same. And part of that was trying to simplify it, but because of how we handle rental and for sale units in the code, we separated them out.
Okay. So there's a sort of an underlying policy decision that there's really no basis for treating them differently, whether I'm building an apartment project or a condo project.
Yeah, and where you see the differences come into play between the for sale and the rental was in the previous staff report when we did those scenarios and then did that feasibility analysis. So what was presented on the 8th kind of breaks it out a little bit more. There's some small kind of tweaks that happen between the for sale and the rental. But when it got time to get to that 10% equivalent, they were the same.
I'm sort of interested, it's kind of a slight change of subject here, but it's included in the same write-up for the City Council, the 2 write-ups, and that is the changes to design review. and I wonder if you could comment a little bit on that. And one question is, I'm a little vague on this, but I believe that some of the changes effectuated by amendments to statutes at the state level call for approvals to be, as a part of the streamlining process, call for approvals to be objective, more objective and less discretionary. Am I correct that the changes proposed from a design review board to a design review advisory commission is to get rid of, or part of the background is to sort of get rid of too much discretionary decision making? And also, I guess I'm sort of curious about this. Maybe I'm just catching up and other people all completely understand it. But as I understand it, another part of the process is to have planning commission treatment of a proposed project before design review rather than the reverse, which is the present process. And I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, so there's a few things there. The first piece with the objective design standards. So right now, those would only apply to projects that fall under SB 35. So it's not citywide, it would only be projects that meet the definition criteria for SB 35. And so we're working on the development of those objective design standards, and we're just finishing those up right now, hopefully to bring back for review in probably a month or two. The difficulty is we have to get rid of any form of subjectivity. So we can't just say a roof must look like nearby roofs. We have to say exactly what that means. So there's a level of detail there that's a little bit difficult. That's a little bit separate from this. So the design review board, the issue that it's really trying to solve is that, and oftentimes the design review board is the first time projects have a public hearing held. So questions that have nothing to do with the design review board brought up and discussed. And so what happens, you get projects that just kind of get into this cycle of going to the design review board, having to come back to the design review board several times. And so they don't proceed to the planning commission where most of these questions would be vetted. So part of the question is there a way that we can move those processes along so that we're addressing some of the real public concerns in the planning commission first, so that by the time it gets the design, all they're talking about is design. That's kind of one. The second piece is that the initial design of the design review board, the purpose of the design review board, was really intended to be just an informal process. So the example that I think Paul gave was that when it was first created, it was really just people laid out the design on the table. Everybody had coffee and kind of looked around, and like there was just a very informal back and forth between the applicant, the city, the designer, the public, to try to like think through the design of a project, and it gets figured out in one meeting. Over the last 20 years, 30 years, we've added a lot of process to this, and we've kind of lost the original intent of what the design review board is. So that was our initial idea behind kind of creating the subcommittee, is to try to get back to that informal process. So there's a lot of questions that came up when we were bringing this up to the city council about, should this happen to all projects? Should it only happen to a subset of projects? How do we want to handle public comment? Should we still, just all those questions, and that's what we're working through. And that's part of why we want to have this go as a pilot and not as an actual amendment, because this is going to take some us tweaking around with the process to figure out what works. We have this process, that's the subcommittee process, that's been going on since the beginning of the shelter in place. And so that's kind of our starting point, but it's going to change over the next 6 months to a year as we pilot this and try to work out some of the kinks.
So the form-based zoning should resolve a number of the issues that that design review has always brought up, and enable somebody to know, okay, I'm going to be able to get this many units. because I'm not going to be asked to push half the units back so that there's no room to walk around the bed anymore. And then we're talking, this is simplification, but we're talking more like colors and what kind of planting and what kind of surface treatment we've got, rather than pushing the whole building around and reducing its contents by 20%. Is that the idea?
Pretty much. I think even more simple is that there's a lot of benefit to the design review process, right? Where projects have come out of design review significantly better than when they went in. Our hope is that we can just restructure this. That's really what they're focusing on. It's not the other things that would be going to planning commission or to city council or that would be handled through other methods. It's really trying to just focus back to its original intent and simplify what they're doing, because that's where we really see the benefit of the design review.
I've got sort of a process question for you, Ethan, and that is, if we have comments to make, you know, this committee sometimes sends letters to the council making recommendations or suggestions. Is the next step in this process sort of ambiguous? And if we address something, you know, we usually like to address something to the city council when it's being teed up for them. I guess two questions. One is, what is the next step, or is it a body other than the city council that will be acting on inclusionary housing next? And, you know, can we address whatever comments we may have to the council or to staff or what?
Yeah, so what we're doing right now is we are in the process of drafting the ordinance, which has the amendments. And what we'll likely do, and I say likely because we're still trying to figure out kind of exactly what we need to do next, because this just kind of happened last week, is what is going to be included in a policy resolution and what's going to be included in an ordinance. So the ordinance is going to be the actual change to the municipal code. Often what we do in a policy resolution is that the policies and procedures that operate how we kind of interpret the municipal code. Those are the things that are a little bit easier to change if we need to. So the ordinance has to go to planning commission for approval. So that's what we're in the process of developing is the ordinance for planning commission. And we're developing it under the direction from city council at that 10% approval. There's still public comments, so it may change, but that's kind of how we're structuring those ordinance changes right now. So what I'd say is if you're interested in putting together a letter, it actually might be helpful for you to send it before we go to planning commission. So if those are changes that need to be in the ordinance or those changes that need to be in the resolution, or if we need to respond to separately, it gives us that opportunity before we start kind of going through this very formal process of review. It still has to go to city council. And that's why there's probably going to be some things that are in the resolution and not in the ordinance, so that city council can have discussion about how they want to change it. And it doesn't trigger all these other changes that need to happen.
Bill Carney, I think you felt pretty strongly about the points you were making about monitoring the success or failure or need for modification, having some sort of a formal process, if I understood what your point was. And there seemed to be a consensus that the other members agreed with that. Do you think we ought to express ourselves in a letter?
Yeah, I would be in favor of that, of a, you know, regular and periodic review to see if the revisions to the ordinance are accomplishing the goals of, you know, creating more housing and including housing including affordable housing, something like that.
Do you want to make that? Do you want to propose that as action with the exact text of the letter to be?
Hang on
after
a
this
sec,
meeting?
Bill. Because I think that what would make sense to include in Bill Carney's, in what Bill's suggesting would be that staff also develop the base, put in write up what is the baseline, so what are we comparing it to, and then what are the expectations that we hope for, so that we can, so all that would have to be part of, that way a review process is looking back on what we said at the beginning and comparing to what actually happened, and then decide what to do next.
I'm not sure what you mean by the baseline. Isn't what is contained in the proposal, the 10% proposal, isn't
No,
that?
Bill had suggested, for example, looking back 10 or even 20 years on how many units have been built in the city of San Rafael over different time periods. And I think we have that data readily available, so I don't think it's a hard research project. And so then you would look at the next 5 years and say, how does that 5-year period compare to, the immediate 5-year period and the prior immediate 5-year period? Look at these different time periods and see if there's some sort of trend that can be, evaluated. Obviously, markets change over those long periods of time, but that's the judgment call that with some future city council and some future community development department would look at.
Yeah, but I think that it's
Ethan,
important to recognize
just a,
things change. Conditions change in these different periods, and that would be part of the evaluation.
Ethan, just a question about that. If we decide to vote on expressing the view of this committee, and we don't get the letter out until our next meeting, which is in November, would that still be timely?
That should be fine. We still have to kind of draft all these documents and then do public noticing. So realistically, we're probably looking beginning of November for when we would probably go to Planning Commission. And just to do kind of a very just to make sure that we're kind of all on the same page. So, and since we still haven't written the ordinance, I'm not totally sure, this is me kind of thinking in the spot. Likely there would be an ordinance that says this is the 10% requirement, and it would refer to a section that says for monitoring and reporting, refer to X document. An X document would be a policy resolution that city has drafted. So the reason why we do that is that if we need to make changes to that policy document, that would be the policies and procedures. So that would say, these are the specific metrics that we're looking at. This is how often we're going to review these metrics. Like the very kind of more specific steps. We don't have to go back and make an amendment to the municipal code if we need to make those changes. It separates the very, very high level things that need to happen in the ordinance with the very nitty gritty that would happen in the policy resolution, and kind of helps everything expedite a little bit faster. So what I'm hearing you say when you're responding specifically to metrics, setting a baseline, review processes, that would be stuff that would most likely be handled in a policy resolution, not the ordinance amendment.
Yeah. So Bill, I would propose that I think we're all in agreement that supporting the policy as it is currently being proposed certainly should help, that we would support that in an effort to include affordable housing in San Rafael. And that further, as they develop these policy guidelines, we would like to see these metrics so that we don't that we're clear on the two being separate documents.
Right. That's an important distinction, that we're okay with the changes now, but we want it monitored in the future. Yeah. Does somebody want to make that in the form of a resolution that Joe can write down and that we can vote on? And
I move.
Go ahead. You move what you just said, or
that we support the 10% affordability ordinance change, I believe, and the need for the I'm sorry, Ethan, what was it? There's the ordinance, and then
I think you said the policy guidelines.
Policy
guidelines, it's all the same.
Provide the measurements to see if that's accomplishing what it was designed to do.
Okay.
I think we'd like to establish a formal review process as part of the as part of the program.
Yeah, I think that's an important refinement of what Katie was proposing.
Yes,
I think the use of the word formal rather than,
yeah.
just kind of a general intention.
I mean, look, our goal is pretty straightforward. We just want to make sure that the city council doesn't just pass something, pat themselves in the back and go off, about their business. We want to look back at this and evaluate it. And
My concern to the policy side again is not just metrics, but it's qualitative as well as to where this housing is going, how we're going about that. So while there's measurements that will see that where that money is being spent is on affordable housing, that we aren't building more ghettos. That's my concern.
I really want us to vote on this and then, but I would add to the proposal that we delegate, and I suggest to Bill and Katie writing a letter and delivering it for our next agenda for approval.
Go ahead.
I just said I second.
It seems to me that since the policy can be changed without going back and changing the ordinance, we may want to include something in the ordinance that says that this analysis should happen at a minimum every so many years, or no later than so many years after this is passed. Something like that, because otherwise it's all policy. And people later can say, oh, we don't need to do it now, we don't have enough time.
I agree with Dirk. Ethan, what would you recommend? Actually, you've been working on this. This is your baby.
Yeah, so I would recommend, everything that I'm hearing you guys talk about is the policy resolution. That's usually what's outlined in the policy resolution. And it's not something that changes very easily. It still has a city council change and requirement that has to happen, and they get considered at the same time. Really, it's for instance, if we miss a word in the ordinance somewhere, we have to go back and go through the process all over again. So what we're trying to do is just as simple as possible, make whatever word changes in the ordinance, and then all the detail gets outlined in the resolution.
Yeah, but I agree with Dirk that we put in the ordinance that there will be a formal review process, not later than 36 months, 48. I mean, I was looking to you for a recommendation on time. Yeah. Then we can refer to the policy document as to what the review looks like and the kinds of things the structure it takes. But
3 years sounds right to me.
Years sounds right to me.
It seems to me though that since this is only a 1-year thing that council is passing, that this might be a moot point at the moment. I don't know if I'm misunderstanding.
It's not 1 year. The council is going to review it in 1 year for sure. The council wants to review it in 1 year. But we're saying we'd like to see it reviewed at some later date.
Okay, perfect. I understand. I thought that it was council was only passing it for 1 year and then would have to repass it. So my mistake, sorry.
Yeah, all the rest would be in policy, but the requirement to review ought to be with some time limit.
Yeah.
Ought to be in the ordinance.
I would agree with that.
What do you recommend
for sure.
time limit? Because I have no sense. What do you recommend as the time limit, Dirk?
Personally, since I'm speaking as staff, and 3 years comes up fast, I would say 5 years. We can always revisit it sooner than 5 years, but yeah, 3 years comes up fast when it comes to development. Yeah,
I agree with Ethan knowing what I know about development.
Yeah, that's why I was saying no later than. And put the 5 years, and then if we have 6 projects or something like that, sure, we can do it earlier. But we just want to make sure that it in fact happens and doesn't slide because policies change later.
So are you comfortable with 5 years? No later than?
I would say I am staff.
I was asking Dirk.
Um,
Yes, yes.
Anybody disagree with 5 years? With no
I would-
later than 5 years?
I would just ask Ethan, do you think that that puts an unrealistic strain on staff, given the resources that we have and the time that it would take to do that?
I think it all depends upon what the metrics are, but a 5-year review cycle is not crazy. That's
Okay.
fairly standard when it comes to other similar type of policies and programs.
We don't have anything that gets done in less than 5 years.
Yeah, if you found a piece of property to buy today and you're trying to get it approved, you're not going to be underway for 3 years.
Yeah, at least.
So allowing for some additional
lucky.
projects.
Joe, has this discussion gelled into a resolution that you can write in the minutes?
Joe, you're on mute.
A motion to support 10% affordability policy guideline change, as well as a suggestion to establish a formal review process as part of gauging the effectiveness of the policy with a review timeline of no later than 5 years. That's
The only change I would make is recommend rather than suggest.
Well, we're also saying that we want it to be in the ordinance that there will be a review process.
And that the 10% is in the ordinance. That the,
Actually, what we're supporting is whatever, I don't remember the title of this thing. We're supporting the whole thing. We're not just supporting
Yeah.
10%. So we have to dig out the title from Ethan's stuff.
Yeah, the
Yeah,
new
we're in support
inclusionary
of-
housing policy. Yeah.
yeah, as stated in.
We're excited about those changes. We support them. We just want to make sure there's a formal review process in the ordinance, and the guidelines for the review process can be contained in policies, but not to occur in not later than 5 years hence.
So
Okay.
Bill, is your intention that the resolution is now captured well enough that we just transmit that to council, or are we still talking about, you talked earlier about drafting a letter for the November meeting?
Yeah, no, what I'm talking about is passing the resolution right now, but it's no good if we don't express it as the sense of the CAC. So yes, I propose that we follow up with a letter to be presented for approval to the November meeting. Remember, we can't approve letters in between meetings because that constitutes arriving at a consensus in violation of the Brown Act.
But that constitutes such a cumbersome process. Isn't there a way to shortcut it that now we have a fairly specific resolution in our minutes? Can't you communicate that in some form or another to the council without us having to approve your letter, a letter?
Bold them, highlight, underline.
Well, it's just a way of getting it in now as opposed
Yeah,
to.
no,
Yeah, I would
understand.
agree.
I thought our minutes went to the council.
But sometimes they may not be read very carefully.
No, letter is better, but I have one clarification question, which is, are we also with this letter supporting the change to the design review process and the positioning of that committee, the design review committee? Are we
That's not presented to us.
only to the inclusionary housing aspect of this, or are we also speaking to the change in design review?
I had it written down as being supportive of everything that was proposed.
Ethan, is the design review change part of the ordinance or part of the policy?
These would all be separate ordinance changes. So there'd be separate policies that go to the planning commission. They may all go on the same day, but the actual things that get voted on will be separate.
Okay, but what goes in the ordinance?
The actual ordinance will not include the design review board because right now we're still trying to figure that out, and it would be a policy resolution. It'd be separate.
So I think we're premature doing that.
Yeah, I agree.
Right, I would think that our letter is going to address the inclusionary housing issues we've discussed and not It changed the
Yeah,
design.
I agree with that. The inclusionary housing component of whatever this report.
None of us have
was-
your stuff in front of us, so it's hard.
So,
For,
Bill,
it's
Well, I
hard to
have it in
give
front
us
of
the
me.
exact wording.
it's a very short letter, but in the meantime, we want to make sure our minutes from tonight will still be seen by the board as being supportive of it. And then we can just follow it up with a letter.
Well, why can't we ask the chair to forward a copy of our minutes in addition on his own letter, in his own email to the council? Say, I just want to draw attention to item number 5 in our minutes. I mean, for your convenience, I'm attaching another copy that I know you've received.
Well, Ethan has said that the November timeframe for the issuance of a letter would be fine. I think a letter is more impactful.
Yeah, I think so. And in the meantime, Ethan knows what we've talked about and we know where he lives.
Yeah, I hope you're hearing this, Ethan, just because, we are writing a formal letter. I mean, what we're saying, I think, makes some common sense and is good for the city.
I was going to joke that Bill has my number. So
I think we need to talk more about the design review process changes separately later.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's more to talk about on that topic. But
Yeah, and there's other things, the density bonus, the hillside changes, et cetera, et cetera.
So back on the drafting of the letter, if you suggested me and Katie working on it, I'd like to include Roger in that at least. And
That's fine.
Back to the whole committee. And the other thing by way of discussion, which I want to say is that I actually don't agree with the 10%. I think it should be 15. So I'm going to either abstain or vote against it, but I'm for the meat of what we've been talking about, which is the regular review of this thing to see if it's accomplishing what the city intends, and therefore could be adjusted later on if it's not. So I'm all for that, and I realize, I'll just end it there. So I may not be voting for it, but I recognize the wisdom of the group here.
We can say we're generally in favor of.
we're concurring with the dissent.
Okay, I don't know if we've taken an official vote yet on the 10%, but we need to do that so that we can, and Bill, and that, I think we need to, let me ask you that, Ethan, do you care about whether we vote on the 10% or that we vote in general?
I defer to the wisdom of the group and Bill's. Either's fine.
The council has already weighed in on this, though.
Yeah, the council has.
Yeah, I think we can properly express what we're saying by saying that we approve in general of the inclusionary housing requirement as
Changes.
as generally approved by the council on September 21.
Okay.
That identifies what it is. That identifies what it is we're generally giving the nod to.
Okay.
Go ahead and vote.
Joe, is it all sufficiently clear to you that you can write it out?
Yeah, I've scratched it out and rewrote it like 18 times, but
Clear as mud, I'm sure.
let's see.
Are we going to vote?
You want to hear it?
No,
Joe, do you
no,
want to read
good.
what you got there?
Yeah. A motion to
That'll be the motion.
the motion would be to generally approve of the new inclusionary components, the new inclusionary components of the policy guideline changes, and a recommendation to establish a formal review process to gauge the effectiveness of the policy with a time frame of no later than 5 years for the cycle. Haven't quite ironed that out yet, but
Okay,
The
just
policy
a little tweak where you said inclusionary housing requirement.
And is it not ordinance, not policy guidelines?
Right.
It's a general statement we're making, not a specific one.
No, we're actually being pretty specific here.
Well, we're being specific, but not about, it includes other things. So we're not naming everything that's in the thing. My point is that we're talking about a general review, et cetera.
And it still does not mention yet that the no later than 5 years
Yes, it did.
be included in the ordinance, not in
Yeah,
the
that's the
policy.
end.
Yes, that was why I asked him to change it to ordinance. If he changed it to ordinance, then it was all included in the ordinance.
Where do you, sorry, can somebody be more specific on where I need to input the language about it being in the ordinance?
You just need to call it the ordinance, not policy guidelines.
At the very top, it would be ordinance.
Right. And then you've done it.
Then with Joe having made that tweak, that's the motion. Do I hear a second?
Second.
Second,
Second.
All in favor?
Right?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, we passed that. And I think implicit, and I don't know if Joe has to put it specifically in the vote, but the understanding is that Bill and Roger and Katie are going to produce a letter expressing that and present it for approval at the November meeting. That's my understanding of what we're doing.
If I could get a copy of Ethan's slide that he sent us, so to have the words, it'd be helpful.
Actually, the slide, and tell me if I'm wrong about this, Ethan. I'm looking at the council agenda report of September 21, and your slide is what was in that backup, right?
Exact same, yeah. In the city council meeting, we refer to it as the 10% below market rate equivalent. And that was mostly just because we were trying to come up with a word. It was scenario 3 in the September 8th meeting, but that doesn't really play when you're not referencing the other scenario. So the 10% equivalent is kind of how we've been informally referring to it.
I think the focus of our letter is actually not going to be on our support so much as it is going to be on the suggestion we have, which is a minor thing, but we think it's important.
And Bill Carney, you were in favor of that, or you had said before you wanted to abstain, or were not in support?
Well, I'm officially abstaining. I didn't say anything on the vote, and so I'm.
I'm sorry, I didn't ask for abstentions.
Yeah. But I'm perfectly happy with Katie and Roger to work on the letter, which, as Roger says, I think is mainly really focused on where do we go once it's passed. Meaning,
Okay, so only Katie and Roger will work on the letter, or Bill, are you involved, or?
No, I'm
we'll
to help with that. Yeah.
We'll get it done. We just don't need to talk too much about how we feel about whether it's 10% or 15%. That's not really the focus.
Like generally in agreement with.
Yeah. So we'll
Don't worry. Joe,
the three of us know what we're doing on this one.
Well, Joe, would you just email to Simon the way you've worded the resolution that we just approved, and then Simon can send it to those 3 people who are going to work on the letter.
Absolutely.
So Bill, are you going to take the lead on the letter, or who's taking?
You all decide that at a later date.
Well, Roger and I have each done time on these tasks before, so Katie, there's an opportunity here.
Because I'm deferring, I will edit.
I'm happy to write the letter if I get this material. It's not going to be a very long letter.
No.
Okay. That concludes our inclusionary housing agenda item. Thank you, Ethan.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ethan.
thank you so much.
Thank you, Ethan.
Thank you.
Unless, well, I guess Simon or any of the committee members, are there any project updates that we want to focus on, or that anybody wants to have questions about? By the way, Joe, make sure that your minutes reflect the fact that Andy did join us. He wasn't here for the original roll call.
Got it. Thank you.
And Andy is, I guess, cat got your tongue, Andy? You're unusually quiet.
It's been a really sorry. I had 2 people I know lost their homes in the fires today. It's just been a really
Yeah.
great day. So, and one of our chefs who shops the markets died as well. So
Oh
Yeah.
my God.
Yeah. Saw that.
it's been a really bad day.
Moving on, anybody want to, Simon, do you have anything, hot, late news about any projects, or does any committee member want to inquire or comment on any pending project? I'm on item number 5.
I have just a brief update regarding Homeward Bound. So they are applying for a conditional use permit for a temporary space at Kerner Boulevard. They'll probably be there for about 2 years while their permanent site is currently being vacated and under construction. And I also wanted to go ahead and mention that we have building permits submitted for the hotel on Francisco Boulevard in East San Rafael. So they will be actually submitting, I believe, in the next week or 2. And they'll be doing some additional like innovative foundation work because it's in an area that's prone to sea level rise.
Sorry, did you say they pulled building permits already? Is it?
They will be applying for building permits within the next week or 2.
Thank you.
So there'll still be some time for the city to review their permit. But we also have additional conversations with that Goldstone project, 1001 4th Street. We are still negotiating with the development team. We're getting, more progress on what we think the exchange will look like in terms of the parking garage and the conveyance to the developer. We haven't gotten into discussions regarding, numbers or figures or monetary value, but we're making good progress. I think we'll have probably a much more substantial update towards the end of the year. So that's still ongoing. And those are the main updates I have for projects.
Simon, besides yourself, who else in the city is involved in those Goldstone negotiations?
Danielle, our director, Paul Jensen, our director of community development, Jim Myers, our parking services, our city attorney's office, our outside counsel, city manager's office. So that's
In the world.
probably half the city, but that's most of it, yeah. From the city side, at least, yeah.
Is there a table big enough for everybody to get around? And
Well, since
It's all virtual.
since we're virtual now, it's quite easy. If we were meeting in person, it would be hard to find a room. But yeah, there's quite a few people involved.
Simon, who's going to be operating the new hotel in East San Rafael?
It's the Hampton Inn and HQ. Yeah, so they've committed to that operator. They haven't said otherwise, so we're assuming it's still a go.
And any word on the Seagate project?
I haven't heard of anything new yet.
Yeah, I'd like to mention also on Seagate and also Northgate Walk, those are 2 housing projects that have been approved. And so I continue to be interested in what's holding them up. Is it the market, or just to understand why they aren't going forward with construction, and I guess, and is there anything the city could do to be helpful with that?
That was some carpenters. Or
Frankly, I agree with, that's worth inquiring about, because we need this, Seagate should be moving forward. They've claimed in the past that they've been waiting to get financing, but financing doesn't, quite frankly, take that long. I'd be curious to know what's really going on, to the extent you can find out, because their experience will be somebody else's experience. Are there cost issues? Is there some, maybe they've got a project that they thought they could do and they can't? I don't know.
My general impression with situations like that, I don't know the specifics, is just that it's a kind of a judgment call by the developer as to when they want to pull their permit, because as I understand it, that's all they have to do, is just pull the building permit.
I don't think they've applied for working drawings, so that's not, I mean, they've got quite a bit.
Oh. Okay.
Is that correct, Simon?
I haven't heard of any building permits that were submitted for the project. So far, a lot of our major planning projects haven't had a lot of movement, and it's really anyone's guess as to why. We don't, once a project is approved, we don't typically go and ask for updates from the applicants unless it's been, your expiration date for your entitlement is coming soon. Then we might go ahead and kind of do a follow-up. So what we can do is ask the planner if they have any particular update for us regarding that project.
It could be a little more proactive, frankly. We're talking about making a lot of changes to city policies here, and part of the reason for doing that is to facilitate development progress. If we're not understanding why developments are getting approved and then not proceeding, that's something we should understand and know about. That shouldn't be something we just passively wait for. We're looking at a precise plan. We're talking about all these changes to inclusionary housing. We should understand the developer mindset very well, not passively. I'm sorry, I don't agree with you on that.
So there's a possibility that that the delay may have nothing to do with this project. My understanding is that they sold lots of property recently. They may be concentrating on other things.
That's absolutely true. I mean, and that's fine. That's great. But we should know that. If it's something else that we should understand while we're making changes to our general plan and all these other things, we should know that also.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
I don't think it's inappropriate that somebody from the economic development group just call up the developer and say, gee, we notice you haven't applied. Is there any problem?
And we can,
if they say none of your business, so what? But my impression is they're, Seagate in particular, they're local folks. I think they'll give you an answer.
Yeah, we can work with the planning division on contact with the developer.
That'd be great.
Can you just make a note as to the corresponding item project updates? Just, it doesn't have to be formal or anything, but just keep in mind, Simon, that we want to see if you can find out why projects that have been fully approved have not started.
Sure, we can go ahead and ask.
Great.
And yeah, that's all I have.
I think that wraps up item 5, the project updates. And we're on to suggestions for future agenda items. I think at our next meeting, we ought to cover the priority development areas as Katie suggested at our last meeting. And Roger, you thought we should, in some sense, revisit
the council
precise plan.
Discussions, as I understand it, on the and maybe Bill can explain it better where they are exactly on the downtown precise plan. And there's a number of issues that were raised. Bill and I were part of a small subcommittee. We worked with the planning staff to change some wording and the consultant to change some things. And I don't know what changes have been actually made, frankly, but I think quite a few were coming down the pike that would satisfy me. But there were some issues that I was concerned about, and I just haven't heard much about it. But I think it would also be of concern to this committee because there are things like historical building ordinances. We talked about the new way of doing design review. There's all this stuff that's happening, and it's mostly good, but there's some things that could be that are merit discussion.
Yeah, and the timing on that, I think it'd be a great topic for our next meeting, and not a bad fit with the PDAs because the precise plan is, working in a PDA area. So understanding that how the precise plan works would be relevant to that discussion of the two new ones.
We have sort of fallen into a pattern of having one central agenda item that takes up most of our evening. But I'm okay with that, with doing a double feature next time, the PDAs and the precise plan for downtown.
The precise plan is 350 pages long. So,
Very precise.
well, I mean, it's a big topic.
Yeah,
And that raises, if we're going to revisit the precise plan, are we inviting somebody from staff to report on it, or is it kind of a working meeting where we discuss it? Which do you have in mind, Roger, or Bill?
Yeah, could I just comment on that, because it has some bearing on that. So the meeting that Roger mentioned at City Council is on the 19th of October, and it's a great opportunity for, all interested to plug in either at the meeting or to the recording of it to see a discussion. And it's not only the downtown precise plan, but it's the whole show of general plan plus precise plan plus EIR plus traffic study. I mean, it's a whole review for the council. And the reason that Barry, I assume, and Paul are doing that is that they're about to roll all this out for public comment. They're going to release these documents, and I don't know what the time frame is, but I'm guessing in the next month or so. So it's an opportune time, for us as representing the public to look at it and talk about it and see if there's anything that we want to have input on. And there's an opportunity to, I guess my point is there's an opportunity to learn about it just by tuning into that meeting that's already taking place in terms of the staff, explanation of what is in these documents.
Should we invite Barry to come to our next meeting?
You can ask him.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can see if he's available.
There are some specific areas that are more interesting, if you will, than others, I feel. I mean, parking, there's some parking discussion in it that I think, Dirk, you would have some interest in looking at and seeing what you think of it. I'm not sure the design element, the design stuff is something that's kind of gotten so far along that I'm not sure. I mean, I think it's something this committee should understand what it is, but I'm not sure we're going to have be able to effectively have a good input into it. I'm not sure we should spend a lot of time on it at present. I'm not sure what they did with historical resources, so I haven't seen any final language. It might be out, I just haven't seen it. I haven't taken the time to go into it and look at it. So, I mean, we may want to pick and choose which aspects of this thing are most useful, where we can be the most useful as a committee.
I've always felt that the downtown precise plan is the one that is most in our sweet spot. And if we're going to discuss the whole general plan, it's too much, I think, especially if we're going to do the PDAs at the same meeting.
I was just referring to aspects of the precise plan just now.
Okay, all right. Okay, I was confused on that.
Yeah.
But even then, to Roger's point, Roger, could you narrow it down to the specific things that you think are most important for us to take a look at?
I can work with Bill O'Connell to maybe refine an agenda, and I would do that probably with Bill Carney also. I mean,
Barry is great at handling those things, so we can sort of script him as to what we want to focus on in the precise plan.
Well, I mean, I think we can go over what's in this and then decide where we should focus, and then have Barry, and then tell Barry ahead of time, hey, Barry, these are the things we want to focus on.
If we want to focus on the PDAs and on this, maybe you guys pick the top 3 or the top 5.
I'm sorry, I missed what you said, Katie.
I said, given even in the precise plan, that there are so many elements, if you and Bill Carney and Roger could identify the top 3 to 5 items that are of most importance to this committee that we should review, that would be helpful.
I think that's what Roger's saying.
Yeah,
That is what I'm saying. Is that okay with you, Bill Carney?
Yeah, the one I would add to your short list is heights. I think
That's fine. I wasn't, I would just point out the things that came to my mind. I just think.
Roger, can you just give me a call next week and we'll talk a little bit about that, and then, as I put it, script Barry to be prepared. And is everybody on board with having both a discussion of the downtown precise plan and the PDAs at the same meeting? I don't want to delay consideration of those PDAs. It kind of snuck up on everybody. And there were complaints in the IJ about it. I don't put too much credibility on that, but it snuck up on me as well.
I'm not sure there's much to discuss in the Northgate thing yet. It hasn't happened. That's a future.
Yeah.
Well,
And all it is planning money. I mean, there's no planning going on. It's just, are we interested in getting money in order to study these areas?
But I think we need to understand I don't understand what that means, honestly.
I understand what you're saying, Dirk, but I think it may be a kind of a surfacey coverage here, but it is, again, so much in our sweet spot that I just want to put it on an agenda. And Simon or anybody else, I don't know who from staff could kind of walk us through what this PDA stuff means.
It would likely be Paul Jensen, but I won't know his availability until I reach out to him. So we'll see.
Okay.
Roger, just about the precise plan, I'd like to second that historical preservation. I feel like we could certainly benefit from some more detail on like what the methodologies are going to be. I feel like that was glossed over a little bit the last time. So
just so you know, Joe, that there's quite a discussion on it. The staff agrees, and they were going to make a number of changes subsequent to these meetings that we had, and they were really positive, good meetings with good good limited representation. I just don't know what because they understood the problems as well as you do and as well as I did, and all of us kind of agreed we needed more specificity. So, but I haven't seen what they finally ultimately have arrived at either. So.
I know that we said that the general plan was maybe a little bit too broad for us, but I do think that zoning would be in our wheelhouse, both in terms of residential and commercial zoning areas and what that looks like. As we talk about housing, what can be built, where, to Katie's point earlier, making sure that communities are integrated. I think that's important, as well as looking at some of the commercial zoning around the
I don't think there are any significant zoning changes, really. Changing something.
Well, I think that could be a problem.
Well, but I think our zoning ordinance allows for the kinds of things that we've been advocating for, by and large. I think the changes are things like the design elements, such as what Bill's bringing up, density and things that you can do within that zoning.
No, I agree, but there is still a lot of single-family zoning in the city of San Rafael.
Right. I don't think there's any move to change the single-family zoning.
Well, right, and I think that might be something that our committee might want to consider. I could be wrong on that, but I think that's definitely in our wheelhouse and something that I know I find interesting to talk about housing availability. And also preserving, commercial areas, et cetera. So if I'm the only one, that's fine, but I think that could be part of the general plan that maybe we do weigh in on that's outside of the precise downtown plan.
I think you're right that it's of interest to us, but in terms of a hierarchy of urgency, I think the downtown precise plan is even more within our wheelhouse. I understand we're a committee on affordable housing as well, and for those reasons, those are appropriate suggestions. But we only meet once a month, and we only have so much agenda space.
The other thing is housing will certainly figure in the discussion of those two PDAs. I mean, I think it's a big part of the
absolutely
of the Northgate Center, and it's a big part of the consideration of the canal as well.
Absolutely.
Well, Bill always managed to adjourn on time. I'm running a little over here, so do I hear a motion to adjourn?
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Good night. Thank you. Good to see you all.
I'll draft a letter.
Good.